This is Note Taker 22, Introduction to Plants. As the protists and fungus that we've already studied, our kingdom Plantae, which are our plants, are also going to be members of the domain Eukaryote, which means that plants are eukaryotes, so their cells will have a true nucleus inside to protect the genetic material. All of our plants that we're going to study are going to be multicellular, and most are going to contain the green pigment chlorophyll so that they can do photosynthesis to get their food, or to make, their food source. Now, with our plants, they can be found on nearly every type of environment, from the icebound Antarctic all the way to the hot, driest deserts of Africa. And our plants are evolved to live in these different environments. Now, scientists believe that plants actually evolved through time from our plant-like protists, which you'll remember some of those that we studied, the Euglena, the dinoflagellates, things like that, because both of them contain the same types of chlorophyll as well as other type of pigments such as carotenoids. Now, plants are going to be broken down into four main divisions. There are not going to be phyla in plants. So when we talked about the domain, kingdom, phylum, unfortunately with our plant kingdoms we don't break to phylum, we actually have divisions. And the four divisions that we're going to look at on this note taker are going to be our mosses, our ferns, and then our angiosperms and gymnosperms on our next note taker. With our plants, before we actually get into our types, we're actually going to talk a little bit about adaptations that plants had to evolve so that they could survive on land. Now, our first plants would have been water dwelling, since they evolved from plant-like protists. And living in the water was nice because you had all the water you needed, which was one of the ingredients that plants needed for photosynthesis. However, the other two ingredients that plants needed for photosynthesis, carbon dioxide and sunlight, those were two that were actually a little bit harder to get when you were a water plant. So, for plants to move onto land where they would have more of a supply of sunlight and carbon dioxide and the water that they needed to evolve certain adaptations. Our first adaptation is our cell walls. Land plants needed a way to support their leaves and the other structures so that they didn't collapse to the ground. They needed a way to stand up, spread their leaves out so that they could absorb the sunlight for photosynthesis. Now, when they were in the water, when we had water plants didn't need to worry about all this support, because water plants have the buoyancy of the water to help them float. However, when you come onto land, there's no more water to help you float. Now you have mean old gravity trying to pull you to the ground. So plants had to evolve or adapt by making cell walls. So cell walls serve two purposes. They help support and protect the plant, and they also helped to prevent the plant from drying out. Because once you move to land, water is now our limiting factor. So when a plant is able to get water, it needs a way to keep it inside. So another thing that plants had to adapt was a way to minimize this water loss. So if you were to look at the leaf of a tree, you're going to notice that one side looks like it has a waxy coating on it. This waxy coating is a protective layer on the stem and on the leaves, and it's called a cuticle. The cuticle is going to help form a waterproof barrier that's going to trap the water inside to help prevent the plant from drying out. So if you think about putting chapstick on your lips, it forms a waterproof barrier to keep the moisture in your lips. That's how the cuticle works on a plant. It forms that waterproof barrier. Land plants also needed a way to obtain the water and nutrients that they were floating in when they were in the water. But land plants just aren't able to absorb the water from anywhere. So most of your plants had to adapt by forming roots or root-like structures that serve two purposes. The first purpose is it helped to hold them into the ground. It kind of gave them an anchor. The other was to help absorb water and nutrients that they needed from the soil. Land plants also needed a way to move food and water and minerals and other nutrients from one part of the plant to the other. Some of our smaller plants, like our mosses, were able to do this by passing materials from one cell to the next through diffusion. However, others, some of our larger plants, actually evolved a transport system much like our system of veins and arteries through our body. They developed a system of tubes that allowed water and nutrients to move throughout their plant. Now, the land plants finally needed a way to reproduce. When plants lived in the water, it was easy for sperm cells to swim to egg cells. You had no problem for fertilization to take place. However, when plants moved to land, they needed a way to get the sperm cell to the egg cell so that reproduction could occur so that we could have more plants. Sperm cells are actually found in the pollen of plants. So to allow the sperm cell to reach the egg cell, these plants relied on things like water, wind, insects, and other animals to carry the sperm cell to the egg cell for fertilization to happen. Now, I mentioned already that there was a big advantage to living on land. Even though water was a limiting factor, your other two ingredients in photosynthesis, your sunlight and your carbon dioxide, were very plentiful for plants. And you can look around you today, look out the window, look out the door, and you can see that plants have been very successful in their move to land. The first group that we're going to talk about is actually something that scientists still disagree about. Some scientists argue that algae really belongs with the protist kingdom because some of them are unicellular, and by definition all of our plants are multicellular. But however, we do have some algae that is multicellular, so other scientists argue that it should belong here with plants. So I do introduce algae, and I do teach it on the first plant note taker. So with algae is very similar to our other plants that we're going to study, except they have no true roots or true leaves. Some of them will have root-like structures, and some of them will have structures that look like leaves, but they don't function truly like the leaves and the roots do in our other plants. So we can have algae that are very simple. We can have unicellular algae. We have other algae that are cells that are grouped together and live together in a colony, or we have organisms, our types of algae, that are multicellular. All of our algae will contain chlorophyll, which is going to absorb the sun's light and absorb sun's energy so that it can perform photosynthesis to make its food. And most of our algae is going to reproduce by spores, which is going to be the cell. We talked about this with the fungus kingdom. It's a reproductive cell that the algae will use to make more. Here are two pictures. The top picture is a picture of unicellular algae underneath the microscope. You can see the individual cells. And on the bottom here we have multicellular algae, which some of you will recognize as a type of seaweed. Now, since algae is water-dwelling, they are not going to have a transport system for water and nutrients. Most are just going to absorb the water and nutrients they need through their cells. Now, with seaweed, seaweed is a type of algae, and it's going to be the type of algae that lives in either salty or brackish water. Brackish is where freshwater and saltwater meet and mix. And when we talk about our algae, we break it into 3 groups, and it's based on both color and structure of the actual algae. So we have red algae, we have brown algae, and we have green algae. And you'll notice in the picture below that not all brown algae is truly brown. Some of it is a dark to an olive green color. And your green algae is usually a much brighter green. We're going to start with our red algae. Most of our red algae are marine. Marine means it lives in salt water. So anytime you see marine, we're talking about in the ocean. Now with our red algae, I do have 2 pictures here of different types of red algae, but the way that it interacts in our life is that we actually collect red algae. Several types are eaten outright, and others are actually used in the making of things like yogurts, chocolate milk, and puddings. Our brown algae, seen below in the pictures, are also marine, which means they are from the ocean or salt water. These algae, we do harvest these algae and use an acid that we can find in them. And this acid is actually used in the making of toothpastes, soap, and actually ice cream. Another name for our brown algae is kelp. And this is a picture of a kelp forest. Kelp can actually grow many meters tall, as long as it has sunlight penetrating in so that it can perform photosynthesis. And when you have a kelp forest, it grows very close together, and this is a great place for larger fish to lay their eggs because it gives the little baby fish, once they hatch, it gives them a safe place to hide against from the bigger predators that would hunt them in the open water. Our green algae is going to be mostly freshwater algae. However, it can also be found in some saltwater environments and on terrestrial land. You can see some growing on rocks or even in trees. And this is the type of algae that joins with the fungus to make a lichen. So a lichen, which we talked about on the fungus note taker, is a fungus and a green algae living together in a good relationship. And you can see a couple examples of the green algae below, and in the center it's a plate of seaweed salad from the sushi restaurant that I go to. So some of your green algae we can eat. Now with our algae, something that they have that helps them float towards the top of the water so that they can continue to get sunlight, a lot of them will form air bladders, which are almost like little tiny air bubbles. Or if you think about little kids at the pool that wear the little water wings on their arm, the mom blows them up and then they walk all funny, but it helps them float in the water. This is how these air bladders function for the algae. It helps kind of hold them up in the water where the sunlight can actually reach them. We're going to move on now to our true plants. And with our plants, we have a couple of groups that we're going to talk about. The first ones that we're going to talk about on this note taker are going to be our seedless plants. Seedless plants are not going to reproduce by seeds. They're actually going to reproduce by spores. So we're going to talk about 2 types of seedless plants on this note taker. The first type we're going to talk about are going to be non-vascular. Our mosses, liverworts, hornworts are going to be very tiny They're going to grow very low to the ground, and they're going to be a type of plant that we call non-vascular seedless plant. Now, with our non-vascular, because they grow so low to the ground, they're not going to need sturdy stems to hold them up. They also lack a vascular system. A vascular system is a system of tubes inside, much like our vascular system, our arteries and our veins. And in a plant, a vascular system is a system of tubes that moves water and nutrients and food throughout the plant. However, our mosses, liverworts, and hornworts are so tiny and they grow so low to the ground, they don't need these tubes. So they do not have a vascular system. Now, because they don't have the system of tubes and they don't have a good root structure, we're going to talk about the roots in just a second, but they don't have a very good root structure, so they need to live in a moist environment so that they can just absorb the moisture they need from their surrounding environment. Now, instead of roots, our mosses, hornworts, and liverworts are going to have thin root-like structures called rhizoids. And the rhizoid's main job is to actually anchor the moss into the ground. It will help it absorb a little bit of water and nutrients, but its main job is to anchor the plant. Now, with mosses, we actually have a lot of beneficial purposes or good reasons or good interactions on how we use moss in our life. We can actually use it as a fertilizer for plants. It actually has a natural antibacterial, antifungal chemical makeup in it. So when we first plant little seedlings, little baby plants, we can actually put moss around it as fertilizer, and it will prevent the little plant from getting fungal and bacterial diseases. In medicine, not so much nowadays, but back in wartime, like our Civil War time, moss was actually used for a bandage for wounds. Because of this chemical inside that prevents bacteria and fungal infections, when people got a really bad cut on the war field, they would actually pull up some moss, and not the dirt side, but the green, like carpety side, they would place against the wound, and then they would tie a piece of material around it to keep their wound from getting infected. Another way that we use moss that's helpful is a sphagnum moss, which hundreds of years it layers up and collects at the bottom of bogs. And we can collect this once it's converted into peat and use it for fertilizer or a fuel source. Here is a picture of moss along a little stream. Moss looks like a little carpet against the ground. This is moss getting ready to go to spore, and you can see the stalks and the little tops. The little green tops there are going to be full of spores. They're going to burst open, spores are going to spread out, and then more moss plants will grow. This is a diagram of the life cycle of mosses, so you can see that the spores will burst out and form new mosses, and occasionally you can actually have structures that act like the gametophyte, which is going to produce something similar to what would be an egg and a sperm, and you can have a sort of sexual reproduction in a moss, or they can reproduce by spores. Here's a picture of a liverwort and a hornwort, other members of our non-vascular seedless plants. The last group we're going to talk about on this note taker are going to be our ferns. Ferns are seedless, so they do not make seeds, but they are vascular plants. Because ferns grow so large, they do need the transport system to move food, water, and nutrients around the plant. Now, this adaptation, having this this vascular system, is what has allowed ferns to be able to grow so tall. So, with our ferns, they have adapted to their life on land. They've developed sturdy stems to support the plant. They've developed the waxy cuticle to prevent water loss. And like our other vascular plants, ones that actually grow from a seed, our ferns are going to have true leaves, true stems, and true roots. Here are some examples of ferns. Now, since ferns are seedless, they are also going to reproduce by spores, just like our mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. However, they need a source of standing water for your sperm and your egg cells to unite to develop into the new plant. Now, when these ferns produce spores, they're actually going to be found on the underside of the fern's leaf, which we call a frond. And the frond is going to be divided into smaller parts that's going to look like smaller leaves. However, it's one big leaf on the fern plant. Now, the developing leaves of a fern, when a fern first starts to grow, the leaves are going to be coiled in and it's going to be kind of curled up on itself. And they look like the top of a violin or a fiddle. So when we talk about a baby fern we sometimes refer to as a fiddlehead because it looks like the end of a fiddle. And you'll see that on the last slide. These are the fronds, the leaves of a fern, turned upside down, and you can see the different ways that the little packets of spores form on the underside of the fronds. And here's an example of fiddleheads. These are baby ferns. They are just starting to grow, but before they uncurl and unfold their leaves, they look like the end of a fiddle, which I've put a picture of in the middle of this slide. Please don't forget to complete the assessment following this note taker. And on note taker 23, we will introduce our plants that actually grow from seeds.